So power imbalances are everywhere, including our open source projects. So this talk is going to cover how rug pulls and forks shift the power dynamics between cloud providers, open source companies, contributors, users, along with how we can all make better decisions about which open source projects that we embrace. And there are loads of links on the slides. So I do want to mention that the slides have already been uploaded to the schedule. So you should have them there so you can get the links as we go along. I wanted to start by very quickly thanking the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for funding the CHAOSS Data Science Initiative, along with the Linux Foundation and Ford Foundation, who also provide some support for the project. And I want to thank Matt German-Prey, who's been working with me on some of the relicensing and forks research that's part of this presentation. And he's my co-author for a paper that we're currently working on related to this topic. So you'll see that in 5 or 6 years, because that's the way academic papers work. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about me, but I have been in the technology industry for about 30 years. And I've spent most of that time working on open source. I'm a board member of Open UK. I'm also deeply involved in the CHAOSS project, where I spend a lot of time thinking about how people can use metrics to understand how to measure and make improvements to open source project health and sustainability. Today, I'm going to start by talking about how the power dynamics in open source have been changing with the proliferation of cloud computing and large cloud providers, along with how those power dynamics change during rug pulls, forks, and other disruptions. Then I'll dive a little bit deeper into some of the different types of rug pulls and their outcomes, including a bunch of data about relicensed projects and their forks. And then finally, I'll talk about what we can do when we're selecting open source projects to minimize our risk and reduce some of the disruptions to our work. So let's start with a little bit of history. Since the beginning of time, those in power have been able to use that power against the weak, often with little recourse. So a well-known example can be seen here, feudalism, where the powerful ruling class controlled the land, leading to oppression and exploitation of the people doing the hard work of farming and protecting that land. So in this scenario, the power was mostly consolidated in the hands of a few, the king, the church, as the ones with the most power. And much of this power was delegated to nobles and lords who administered the land and provided protection in the form of military services, but they served under the king, who could take away this power. And these lords and nobles then, of course, held power over the peasants who worked the land and had little to no power or autonomy despite doing most of the real work. Now the lines are fuzzier, the consequences are less extreme, but with the rise in popularity of the cloud providers, the open source power dynamics are looking a little bit similar to the feudalism example. But in our case, we do have ways to flip those power dynamics, which I'll talk more about. So here at the top, we have the cloud providers. And with many of our applications moving into the cloud, it's become really easy to just use the many services provided by these cloud providers. If you need some piece of open source software, you can pretty easily go to one of these major cloud providers like AWS, Microsoft, and they probably have a service you can use to create it. So in many cases, they offer these services for open source projects, while sometimes contributing very little, if anything, back to those projects. And this tends to, shall we say, upset some of these smaller companies who have less power than the big cloud providers. And in some, but not all cases, those smaller companies might have the power to relicense an open source project, which can then flip the balance of power between that smaller company and the cloud provider. But this power play from the smaller companies puts those maintainers, contributors, and users in a position of even less power and creates friction around the project that was just relicensed. So within open source projects, those with the least amount of power can then fork the project to, again, flip those power dynamics. But this is a lot of work, right? Forking a project is not easy, and it may or may not be successful. So one thing, though, that makes these open source power dynamics very fuzzy is that many of these companies actually fit into multiple categories. So for example, cloud providers are also users, contributors, and maintainers of open source software. And I'll talk more about this when we talk about the forks. So this is just like it sounds, right? Companies pull the rug out from underneath the rest of us when they use open source to build a user base and a community before making some sort of power play and doing something like relicensing or otherwise disrupting the project. So open source projects that are controlled by a single company have a higher risk of disruptions over the longer term because they operate at the whims of the company holding the power. And there's little recourse for us as outside contributors or users with less power when that company decides to go in a direction that doesn't align with the expectations of the other participants within that community. So for company-originated open source projects, you can consider the reputation of that company as a steward of open source projects. However, while you might think that a company is an excellent open source citizen and their projects are not likely to be relicensed or forked, always keep in mind that companies can change direction with little to no notice. And you never know when they might be acquired by a company that maybe isn't so open source friendly. And companies change their strategies, right? They can change it at some later date, and it's possible also that companies can just go out of business and abandon their open source projects when they no longer exist to contribute to them. Now, projects are much less likely to be disrupted by rug pulls if they're under neutral, well-run foundations, because those foundations encourage governance structures that create a level playing field where a whole bunch of people from a bunch of different companies can all work together as equals to create something that benefits everyone, which I'll talk about in more detail later. Now, as I said, the power dynamics are a little more complicated than that very simple pyramid diagram that I showed earlier, because companies also need to answer to their investors, their boards, their other stakeholders, who are then in a position of power over that company, whether it's a small company or one of the very large cloud providers. And so lately, companies have experienced a lot of pressure from VCs, from shareholders, from other investors to relicense their open source projects to generate more revenue from their licenses, especially when a vendor's revenue streams are, maybe they rely solely or mostly on an open source project. So their investors and shareholders become concerned that the vendor is not making as much profit as possible from these open source projects. And this is compounded if other companies, often large cloud providers, are competing for some of those same customers and profiting from the open source project that smaller vendor has put substantial resources into developing. So these concerns about profitability lead to pressure from investors to put the project under a new license that maybe has more restrictions than what would be possible under an open source license. So these restrictions often make it more difficult for cloud providers or other companies to profit from these newly relicensed open source projects. And in several of the high-profile relicensing events, like the ones from Redis and Elastic, in the relicensing announcement, they mentioned that they were finding it difficult to sustain the company, while these cloud providers are profiting from the work and taking business away from the smaller company driving that open source project. So this flips the power dynamic and increases the power associated with that smaller company while decreasing the power of the cloud providers. But this isn't the end of the power dynamic flip, which you'll see about when I talk about forks. So the disruptions caused by rug pulls can result in forks. But let's go on just a little teeny tiny side quest for a quick overview of what I mean when I talk about forking. So in the days before GitHub, forks usually referred to hard forks, sometimes called hostile forks, variant forks. These hard forks are created with the purpose of starting a brand new branch of development that diverges from and often competes with that original project. So hard forks are in contrast to social forks, which are popularized by GitHub. That's what happens when you click that fork button on a repo. So those social forks are often used for collaboration while contributing back to that original project using a pull request. I'm focused on hard forks, so throughout this presentation, all references to forks are hard forks, not those GitHub social forks. until near the end, where I do actually have one slide about stars and GitHub social forks. So these hard forks are a form of rebellious collective action that flips the power dynamics in the pyramid and allows those of us with less power to take control of our own destiny by taking back control of our open source projects in the form of a fork, where we control the governance of this newly formed project. However, it's not quite as simple as that, right? Forks are very hard work. So while you often hear people say, well, anyone can fork a project and run with it, it actually takes a significant amount of people and resources to actually make that fork successful. And often those people and resources are provided by very large companies. So I mentioned that a smaller company can relicense an open source project to flip the power dynamic and gain power back from the cloud providers. But those cloud providers can then flip the power dynamic again by forking the project and gaining the power back from these smaller companies. And this, frankly, works pretty well because those large cloud providers can often put a significant number of people and other resources into making that fork successful. Okay, now that we've talked about the power dynamics, I'm going to do a deeper dive into rug pulls, including the forks and other disruptions that result from them. And you'll see how these power dynamics play out in a few different scenarios. So one of the most common rug pull methods over the past few years has been relicensing of open source projects. So the companies controlling these projects used open source to grow their user base and as a way for the projects to become widely used and popular. Then they moved those projects under non-open source licenses. So in these three cases, the result was rebellious collective action by users and, in one case, contributors coming together to create a fork of the original project. And I'm going to talk about each of these examples on later slides, so I'm not going to cover them in detail here. But the important thing to remember is that rug pulls are often related to relicensing, but they also have consequences in the form of the forks that result from those relicensing. Now, the research that we've been doing within the CHAOSS project is focused on relicensing events that result in a fork of the original project. But it's important to remember that not all relicensing events and not all rug pulls result in a viable or successful fork. So I'll admit I haven't spent any time looking into why some relicensing events result in popular forks, others don't. So I'm not going to go into detail, but it's important to remember that there are rug pulls that impact users and contributors of a project that for whatever reason don't result in a successful fork. Now the Perforce Puppet rug pull is really interesting and personally interesting to me because I did work at Puppet for a number of years. But it's interesting because it wasn't technically a relicense, but it ended up having mostly the same result. So Perforce acquired Puppet back in 2022, and then in November 2024 announced that it was going to move their binaries and packages developed by the Puppet team into a private location, which they claim is for security and stability reasons, which I totally believe. In the announcement, they spent quite a bit of time explaining how this was not a relicense. It was different than the others. They also said that they'd be slowing the frequency of source code contributions back into the public repository. So they're effectively moving the development behind closed doors. Again, technically not a relicense, but as you can imagine, it's had a similar result. So it's resulted in a fork called OpenBox. So in OpenBox, the users and contributors are taking power back after the Perforce rug pull. Now, the fork was announced in January, so I haven't done any analysis on it yet, but I'm actually looking forward to digging into that one soon. Now, open source projects are complex, and no two open source projects are exactly alike. So throughout the rest of this presentation, you'll see that the different types of open source projects experience different impacts depending on the situation surrounding the fork and the project. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on this slide, but you can find that you can find all of the data I'm going to talk about today in the CHAOSS repository linked on this slide. And of course, we welcome feedback and contributions. And if you want to dig into any of the code and the data, it's all there for you to have a look at. And so the data is actually stored in GitHub using Jupyter notebooks. And The important thing to remember is that you don't actually need any data science skills or programming skills at all to understand these notebooks. This is the thing I love about Jupyter Notebooks is you can actually just ignore the code and look at the text and the output, and you can kind of get a feel for the results. So I will start by saying there is no perfect data to understand the impact that employees of particular organizations have on an open source project. The goal of this research is not to have perfect data, but to get a feel for how employees of particular organizations participate in these projects. So while it can be pretty difficult to gather data about where people work, I think I've come up with a pretty reasonable solution by only gathering data about the most significant contributors. So those with so it's 10 or more commits for the bigger projects, so Elasticsearch, OpenSearch, and 5 or more for the smaller projects. So I was able to identify employers for those significant contributors, and then I filled in the gaps by just talking to the people who participate in these projects to figure out who some of those people were. And as I mentioned, I used commits as a starting point, but commits aren't necessarily a good indicator of the amount of work. So the results also look at the number of lines added and lines deleted to get kind of a feel for the magnitude of the contributions. And I also only focused on the primary repository for each of the projects. So the reason I focused on organizational affiliation data and where people work is because it's important when looking at relicensing and forks. So I started with that, and I also expanded into looking at stars and forks as a proxy for usage. It doesn't give us usage, but it gives us kind of a feel for it, which I'll talk more about later. And there are loads of ways to contribute to open source. So the plan is to look at some other metrics for these projects. So I've been currently looking at pull requests and looking at maybe time to first response and time to close for some of these. So I'm going to look at that and compare whether it's different depending on whether you work for the dominant employer. So we'll see what happens with that. I'm currently gathering that data. But let's dig into each of the projects. So Elastic moved Elasticsearch under the server-side public license, dual licensed with the Elastic license, which are not OSI approved licenses. So they're not open source. So Elasticsearch was no longer an open source project in 2021 when they were relicensed. So as you'll see on the next slide, almost all of the existing contributors to Elasticsearch were Elastic employees. So the relicense had very little impact on contributors since there were very few outside contributors. But there was a pretty big impact on some users of Elasticsearch. And those users had to decide whether they could use it under one of these licenses. So this resulted in the decision at Amazon AWS to fork Elasticsearch into a new project called OpenSearch so they could give their customers an alternative to Elasticsearch. Now, without a strong open source contributor community outside of the company, there wasn't a strong contributor base to drive the fork. So while AWS had a few people who had contributed to Elasticsearch before, they were mostly starting from scratch with employees who were still learning the code base. A few exceptions to that. But it did take them a while to get something out, and frankly, it was a lot of hard work. So in this example, I'm comparing the year before Elasticsearch was originally relicensed. So during this first period, the project was still under the Apache 2.0 license. In the second and third periods of time, the project was under the SSPL and the Elastic license. So this is during the period when Elasticsearch was no longer an open source project. And you can see in the data that it just made very little difference, right? Because Elastic never built a strong contributor community around the project. So in both of those time periods, Elastic employees were making 95 to 97% of additions and deletions to the code base, and no more than 3 people from outside of Elastic made 10 or more commits in any given year. And while it's not on this slide, I also looked at the 6 months after they added the AGPL, and there were no non-employees with 10 or more commits. So adding the AGPL did not get them more contributors, which isn't surprising given that they didn't have many contributors when they were open source before. Now in this example, this is OpenSearch. I'm comparing the early days of the OpenSearch fork, the first year, with the final year of when OpenSearch was moved from Amazon into the Linux Foundation, and then 6 months after the move to the LF. So I I actually spent some time in the OpenSearch community shortly after the fork, and in that first year, a lot of the work was being done within Amazon. So while the code was public, a lot of the discussions and decisions were happening inside of the company. So it's not surprising that we see here in the data that most of the contributions were coming from Amazon employees in that first year. So in the most recent years, you can see that this has gradually shifted to bring in more contributors from outside of Amazon. And they've made loads of improvements in their governance, which allowed more people to contribute and then facilitated the move into the Linux Foundation, which I think is a great step for OpenSearch. It's also worth noting that one individual from a company called Ivan made most of the non-Amazon contributions in all of these time periods that you see here. But there were also significant contributions from other people. So this is trending in the right direction from my perspective. However, I was a little bit surprised that there wasn't more of an uptick after the move into the Linux Foundation. So this suggests, and this is one data point, keep in mind, but this suggests that starting a fork under a company and then moving it into a foundation doesn't have the same benefits as starting the fork under a foundation. So you'll see some of that data in the next couple of examples. And these are just a few cases, so this is not broadly generalized, but you can see some of the differences. So Terraform contributions were made mostly by HashiCorp employees, so even when it was an open source project. So from that standpoint, the original project is pretty similar to Elasticsearch. However, you'll see that the fork is very different from OpenSearch in some ways, but similar in others. So the OpenTofu fork was started under the Linux Foundation. So from the start, it was under a neutral foundation rather than being started by a single company. However, in other ways, it's a lot like the OpenSearch fork because it was driven by users rather than the people who'd been contributing to the original project. So let's have a look at the data. So similar to the Elasticsearch example, HashiCorp employees were making all of the significant contributions to the main Terraform repository, even before the relicensing, with one or two people outside of the company making significant contributions. So it's not surprising to see the situation is about the same after they relicensed. Now, OpenTofu, on the other hand, has contributors from a wide variety of companies, with Spacelift employees making the most significant contributions. However, it's also interesting to note that actually none of these contributors contributed to Terraform before the fork. So like with the OpenSearch example, these were a bunch of contributors who had to learn the code base. And this is in contrast to Valky, which we'll talk about soon, where a bunch of people, the developers, moved to the fork. And in all of these projects, there are also a lot of people who've made small contributions, in particular for the foundation projects. Now, this is a very different example from the ones I just talked about. So in this case, there were a lot of contributors to Redis who were not employees of Redis. So when Redis moved to non-open source licenses, these contributors forked the project and started a new project called Valky. Now, the new project was started under the Linux Foundation. So from the start, again, it was under a neutral foundation rather than being started by a single company. And even though Valky is relatively new, you can also see how it's different than the previous examples. So looking at the data, where the Redis project differs from Elasticsearch and Terraform is in the number of contributions from people who are not employees of Redis. So in the year leading up to the relicense, when Redis was still open source, there were substantial contributions from employees of other companies, with twice as many non-employees making 5 or more commits. So Redis employees did make more additions and deletions, but these were inflated by a small number of very large change sets. And you could see that employees of other companies made almost twice as many commits from about a dozen people. In the year after the relicense, all of those external contributors from companies like Amazon, Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, Ericsson, who contributed 5 or more commits to the Redis project in the year leading up to the relicense, stopped contributing. Some made a couple of commits after the relicense, which looked to me like work in progress, so things that were merged, that were created before the relicense and then merged after the relicense. But all of the contributors who made 5 or more commits after the relicense were Redis employees. Now, Valky had 52 people employed at 13 companies in the first year of the fork, and 22 of those people previously contributed to Redis and are now contributing to Valky. So there are contributions from a variety of companies, with Amazon having the most contributors. The Google data is actually just a little bit misleading, because while Google employees made a large percentage of additions and deletions, most of those changes can be attributed to just 2 PRs, which were related to formatting changes, which are still changes. Those are still adds and deletes, but yeah, but that was related to just to 2 PRs. So there are also many contributions coming from Alibaba, Ericsson, Samsung, and loads of other companies. Now, I think, as we all probably know, it can be difficult and or impossible to accurately measure the actual usage of an open source project. So while it's difficult to do that, Sophia Vargas, Georg Link, and a few others have found that there is a strong positive correlation between usage and GitHub forks and stars in a paper where they use some internal Google telemetry data. So this isn't perfect, and I'm generally not a fan of stars and forks, but I think it does help highlight some trends. So for each project that experienced a relicensing event, there was a temporary spike in GitHub forks around the time of the event. So this isn't surprising. This indicates that people wanted to keep a local copy of the source code in response to this collective action threat. And then shortly after the relicensing event, the number of new GitHub forks and stars were at a slightly lower level than before for all of the relicensed projects, which indicates that slightly fewer people were interested in contributing to and using these relicensed projects. Now, for each of the hard forks, there was also a pattern. So they all experienced a spike in the number of GitHub forks and stars shortly after the announcement, and then a reduced number in later months. So this demonstrates that during this period of uncertainty, people were considering the hard fork as a response, a possible response to this collective action threat. Now, when comparing the relicensed project with its hard fork, in all cases, the forks had fewer new GitHub forks compared to the original project. So OpenSearch also had fewer new stars than Elasticsearch, but the other hard forks that were started under Foundations actually have more new stars than the original relicensed project. So this is a lot of data and a lot of talking, but all of this taken together indicates that both the original project and the forks continue to exist together in parallel with both projects being used. So it's not like one has taken over the other in any of these cases. However, the relicensed projects seem to have reduced usage due to some users switching to the hard forks. And this is more pronounced for the forks that were started under a foundation, which I think that, for those of us that have been spending any time in and around these projects, anecdotally, this seems about right, because we know that people are switching to Valky, for example. So what can we do, right? These rug pulls and power dynamics create significant issues for those of us who use and contribute to these projects. So as maintainers, contributors, even users of open source, we devote our most precious resource to these projects, our time, and we need for these projects that we spend time on to be sustainable over the long term, to avoid wasting this very precious resource. So there's no way to predict which projects will be sustained over time versus the ones that might experience a rug pull, but there are some warning signs. And there are some things we can think about before we spend too much time working on a particular project. So let me start by saying I'm not a lawyer. I'm going to gloss over the details, and you should talk to an actual lawyer if you want to understand this better. But there are things that can increase or decrease the likelihood of a rug pull when a project is owned by a company. Contributor license agreements, or CLAs, create a power imbalance within open source communities where the power is tilted toward the company who owns the project and who controls that CLA, giving the company more power than any of the other contributors. So, for example, the power to relicense a project in some cases. So when projects use CLAs, rug pulls are more common. I will mention that Elasticsearch, Terraform, and Redis all had contributor license agreements that facilitated their relicensing. Now, projects that use a developer certificate of origin, on the other hand, don't suffer from this type of power imbalance. That's not to say there might be other types of rug pulls or other types of power imbalances in those projects. but they aren't likely to relicense. So the type of license used by a project might also influence certain types of rug pulls, but that's definitely a question for a lawyer. So I'm just going to quietly move off that slide. Now, I talked earlier about how rug pulls and power plays are more common when a project is controlled by a single company, as we just saw in several examples. So one way to make better use of our time is by supporting projects that are under neutral foundations whenever possible. CNCF, Linux Foundation, Eclipse, Apache Software Foundation, these are all neutral foundations. Now, projects are much less likely to experience rug pulls if they're under these neutral, well-run foundations, because those foundations encourage governance structures that create a level playing field where people from a bunch of different companies can work together as equals to create something that benefits all of us. But it's not enough just to focus on projects under neutral foundations. You also need to look at project governance. So while it isn't very common, rug pulls can and do still happen to projects under neutral foundations, usually when most or all of the development is coming from the employees at a single company. So there are examples of these, I think, probably in most foundations, but one example of this was the CNCF project Cortex, where Grafana was driving most of the development. So they had enough control over the developers and the power to make unilateral decisions about what those developers worked on. And they were making changes that they didn't want to relicense under Apache 2.0. So they forked Cortex. They effectively forked their own project that they had contributed to the CNCF and created Mimir as a company-owned project. Still open source, but now under the AGPL v3 instead of the Apache license. So it can help to look for neutral governance, where leadership positions and maintainers come from a variety of different organizations, with a fair and transparent process for selecting those leaders. And this creates that level playing field that I was talking about earlier, where we can all participate as equals, when neutral governance is combined with neutral ownership of projects under foundations. Now, I talked about neutral governance, but we should also be thinking about contributor sustainability in general. Does the project have enough contributors to sustain it over time and to replace the existing maintainers when they move on to something new or something else? For the open source projects that we rely on, are there enough contributors that if one of them retired on a beach tomorrow, left their laptop at home, and gave us no notice, could the project continue with minimal disruptions? Now, this leads directly to how companies can help open source projects that are important for them. So I've talked a lot about the power dynamics, but companies also have the power and the resources to make real improvements. And company and corporate involvement can positively impact the sustainability of our open source projects, including the forks, right? Companies can allocate employee time to contribute to projects or provide funding and other resources to help sustain some of these open source projects. So having your employees working within a project also helps you understand those power dynamics that might be at play and better understand the strengths and weaknesses of that project while also being able to influence the project from within. Now, there are loads of ways you can think about the sustainability of a project, and you can find ways to improve the sustainability from within for the projects that you use. Now, some of you may already be familiar with the CHAOSS project. We have a series of project viability metrics models that were developed by Gary White at Verizon. So thank you, Gary. And these can help you think about which projects you should spend time on and which projects maybe might not be viable over the long term. So if you're deciding whether to embrace a project and want to dig into more details than what I just covered, those viability metrics models would be a really great start. We also recently launched a series of practitioner guides. So each guide is focused on a single topic, but the real value of these guides isn't actually in the metrics at all, but in how to make meaningful improvements within an open source project across several key areas. So things like responsiveness, contributor sustainability, organizational participation. So if you're looking for additional ideas for improving your project, these guides are a pretty good place to start. And as I said, the slides are already uploaded on Sketch, so I won't spend any more time on this slide except to mention that you have all of these resources and links. Now, with the rise in popularity of large cloud providers, the open source power dynamics are looking looking still a little similar to that feudalism example that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. But in our case, what's different is we have the ways to shift these power dynamics. A smaller company deciding to move a project away from an open source license can flip the power dynamic and gain power back from those large cloud providers. But they also shift the balance of power further away from contributors and users at the same time when they decide to relicense that project. And this encourages those who now have less power to take a rebellious collective action to fork a project, which again flips the power dynamic in favor of contributors and users, often including those cloud providers as users. But within the open source world, we're better off than those peasants and serfs because we do have certain freedoms that allow us to take these rebellious collective action to gain power back by forking projects when others abuse their power. So with that, I will open it up to questions, and we have 5 minutes between you and food and drinks in the Tux Trek. Questions? Yes, Hazel. Hazel, yeah.
So, do you have any idea of perhaps in the future what types of levers we might see being developed in addition to relicensing and forks in order to help contributors and communities protect the common resources that they have, know, and love, and keep them healthy and growing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And one of the things that we've seen, so I was on a panel with James Governor, who's an analyst at Red Monk, and he told me that at least one company has talked to them and was talking to them about doing a relicense and changed their mind after they saw the success of OpenTofu and Valky forks. So I do think that just these existing examples are causing a lot of companies to think twice about the rug pulls. So I do think that what's happened already is causing people to think harder about what they do with their open source projects because there are consequences. And I think historically, a lot of us, me included, I really never thought that a fork would be wildly successful without it starting from a contributor community. So MySQL, MariaDB, LibreOffice coming from OpenOffice. These were contributor communities that are the contributors that forked the project. And I really did think that was really the only way for a fork to be successful. And this is proving me and others wrong. So I think that companies are thinking twice about it. But the other thing that I think we can do as contributors and users and maintainers and customers of some of these projects is to push for more neutral governance where possible. We're not always going to convince people, but I think it's one mechanism. Yeah, Dirk.
So I think that the retaliatory aspect of we fork after you do something bad is kind of nice, and I'm super proud that the Linux Foundation has led a couple of really good ones. But what I really want people to think about is the opposite. Get to the point where the fork isn't the option, and that is us contributing. Because the more outside people contribute, the higher the risk becomes for that project owner, for that medium-sized company when they do a fork. So we all, through our companies, can protect the projects that we rely on by being there and being in the project. This is what I talked about this morning.
Yeah.
If you sit back and just watch what happens, you're just a passenger.
Yeah.
You want to be driving.
Yeah. So Dirk's comment is, at us as individuals and companies being involved in some of these open source projects, we can influence them not relicensing and influence them not having these rug pulls that we then don't need to fork. Yeah.
Kind of a segue. I'm curious about your data. Can you see the evolution of the affiliation of the contributors? Because one of the questions or comment that I've received from one of the companies forking is like, as soon as we saw contribution coming from the outside, we ended up hiring them. So I wonder if you can prove this statement with your data.
I haven't looked at it that way, but I would be surprised if there's not an awful lot of truth to that, because every company that I've ever worked for in open source, we've hired people out of these open source communities. So there is probably a bit of that in the data that's not really captured. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So you talked about using stars and forks as a proxy for usage. Have you considered using GitHub release downloads?
No. Downloads are problematic, I think. So the question was, have you considered using release downloads? The problem is that people don't generally get it from the release downloads. They tend to get it from the package managers. So I am working on another project that we're not well, we might look at forks and relicensing, but we're looking at more on the supply chain, more from supply chain impact. And for that, I think we're probably going to look at the usage from some of the package managers. So I think that's probably a better way to do that. But it's really hard in a lot of cases to tie the stuff in the package managers back to the actual repository that it came from. And there's a lot of data challenges that I have not dug into yet. That was a lot of questions all in. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you consider looking at the comments and reviews for comments before they are merged? Because sometimes you have a comment and you have at least 10, 20 people which will review that code, and you have a really nice history of who's really involved.
That is what I'm looking at right now. Yeah, because the stuff I looked at so far was literally just the commit data, and I didn't actually look at the PRs at all. And by looking at the PRs, I'll be able to look at the reviews and the comments, and also look at things like time to first response from, maybe somebody at the company or somebody else, and do the company PRs have a better or a worse time to first response than the others? What about time to close? Things like that. So I'm gonna look at that next. It's a good point. Yeah. Yeah.
So I came 10 minutes later, I'm asking something that you're already addressed. But like when I try to avoid raffle situations, and I specifically think of situations like the Bindemy one, where they like stopped updating their containers without telling anybody, and that was bad from a security perspective. My first thought is, okay, I'm going to avoid companies that are venture capital backed, because I think they they need to make profit at some point, and they begin with a business model that might not be sustainable, and then they need to make money somehow, and of course, it kind of invites a rabbit hole, is my thinking. But I was wondering, what is your experience in that regard? Should I keep avoiding venture capital backed companies, or is your experience that it actually doesn't matter at all?
So I don't have data on this. I would say that the venture capital backed open source projects are probably realistically a little more problematic than others. But there are probably some of them that are just fine. So it depends a lot on the individual project. It depends a lot on the governance within that project. So I would maybe, I would consider it being venture backed as maybe a one red flag. But then I would look more at, who's actually contributing, who's maintaining it. Do they have a lot of contributors and maintainers from other companies? Because if they have a lot of maintainers from other companies, then it's probably a bit less likely to have issues. Yeah. The question in the back was first.
Yeah. Do you see any other option that could be taken other than relicensing to take back power? Because it's I see a lot of these companies that do it it's mostly an indication that things are not sustainable in reality, and the option would otherwise be going out of business and not maintaining the project anyways. So you see any other see projects like Linkerd not releasing stable images as an option?
Yeah, that was the example I was thinking about as you were talking about it. So there are a lot of examples. So the Linkerd example of not releasing the packages anymore, that's an example. The Bitnami, not releasing their container images, that's another example. There are loads of things that can happen when these companies are under pressure from investors and shareholders. And I do feel for these companies, so I'm not unsympathetic. I mean, it is really hard to build a business and a company around an open source project. Well, it's hard to build a business and a company regardless, and then building it around an open source project, I think, just makes it even harder. So I do feel for these companies. They're often put in a really, really tough position, and I wish they wouldn't do what what some of them have done. I wish they wouldn't relicense, but I also don't know the internals within that company. I don't know if they were going to go out of business. Although it's interesting because Rachel Stevens, also from Red Monk, did some kind of back of the napkin financial analysis on some of these companies that are relicensed, and it doesn't look like it really actually had much, if any, financial impact. So I think they did this and maybe didn't get the impact that they thought they were going to get. So I don't know that it's really going to help if you're already struggling to make ends meet with as your company. Yeah.
I have a smaller question kind of thing, but I'm intrigued. I mean, when there is relicensing of a project, what happens to the open, pull request? Can they relicense the project and then merge pull requests that were made under a different license?
Ooh, that is definitely a question for a lawyer. Sorry.
I understand.
My guess is that that they can probably still merge them because it's all about the CLA. So they signed that contributor license agreement, which gave the company the power to kind of do whatever they want with that contribution. So I think they can probably still merge it. But you should ask a lawyer. Not legal advice. Okay, I'm gonna call it quits because I run 5 minutes over. I am between you and food and beverages.